Okay, I think we'll get started now because we're just beyond 1 o'clock and we've got a lot to get through. I'll obviously start off with some housekeeping, so we won't get into the meat of it until about 5 past. But welcome to this webinar about the social housing rents consultation, which I think has quickly become known as the rent cap consultation, which was issued by the department on the 31st of August. For responses to be given to the consultation by the 12th of October. We've got today 3 speakers in addition to myself. I'll be chairing this session. We've got Sam Griggs, a partner in the housing management and property litigation team, who's going to be taking us through the consultation, the black letter of the consultation, and then we'll move on to a more sort of discursive content. John Corris, partner in art and head of real estate, who is going to talk about what's missing, particularly in terms of shared ownership, because a lot of concerns have been expressed about the likely increases to shared ownership rents next year. And then we'll move on to Jonathan Jarvis, another partner, who will look at the sort of wider issues, and again, some of the things which have not been raised in the consultation, but particularly looking at impact on business plans and how we square all the rent cap with the other pressures on registered providers, both local authorities and private registered providers, in terms of business plans, investment, and services, including safety, in particular, building safety, because those costs are ramping up for people, and looking at stress testing and the sort of modelling options of what you should be looking at in deciding how to respond to the consultation. That should take us to around about the 30 to 35 minute mark, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions and answers. And as we talk our way through, please do put down your questions using the Q&A box. And then we will tick them off, pick them up when we've finished, and we should have a good 15 to 20 minutes to answer your questions. So please do get typing as and when a question occurs to you. If there are questions that we haven't answered by the end of the session, which will be before 2 o'clock, then we will pick those up separately, and we can email you a response back. So please do use the Q&A session. The only slides we've got today are from Sam, when Sam is going to be talking about the consultation itself. After that, it'll be without slides. And just to remind you, as always, we'll have a short feedback survey at the end, which we'd ask you to fill in and let us know your thoughts. And if you've got any other ideas for topics that you would like to hear from us about in our webinar programme. So with a very short introduction before Sam gets started, the consultation didn't come as a surprise to anyone. There's been plenty of talk throughout the early summer and the summer about the possibility of a cap being imposed on social rents and affordable rents. And so, and also talk about the sort of possible levels that cap might be. And the consultation has reflected those conversations with 3 options of a 3% cap, 5% cap, or 7% cap, instead of the standard guideline limit on increases of CPI plus 1%. So that translates into an increase next year of the lower of CPI plus 1%, or 3, 5, or 7%, depending on what the government decides. But they've expressed a clear preferred option of 5%. So what we're going to look at is obviously the questions raised in the consultation, and we'll discuss some of the possible answers, how you might want to go about answering them. And as I've said before, what's missing from the consultation, which registered providers need to know about. Very conscious that we've got both a mix of housing associations, not-for-profits and for-profit registered providers, and also local authorities. local authorities obviously became subject to the rent standard for the first time in 2020. So to that extent, this is the same principles apply across the board, although in terms of business planning, different aspects, different elements will apply. So that's it from me for the time being. I'm going to hand over to Sam now, who will take you through the detail of the consultation itself.
Thanks, Nick, and hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So as Nick said, I'm going to go through the nuts and bolts of what the consultation includes and what it says, some of the key points that you will need to take away. There's also the questions in the slides, so we'll have a quick look at those, and just some considerations for you to think about. So as Nick said, the current position is CPI plus 1% if we're increasing our social or affordable rent on a yearly basis. The rent standard is in place until 2025, or it's meant to in its current form, and obviously this is going to be an amendment to it by direction. We've had lots of queries from clients about rent increases, both for tenants but also for shared owners, which John's going to talk about in a little while. This is all in the face of the cost of living crisis, with CPI until yesterday was 10.1, it's now 9.9%. So that plus 1% is just simply unaffordable for a lot of people. And this is a concern for both tenants who are looking to be receiving this increase, but also for RPs who are going to have to try and recover that money. And we need to think about the extent by which you will be able to recover and what's reasonable. And this is why we've had the consultation, which, as Nick said, is not a surprise. There was a lot of conversation beforehand about what people were going to do, what organisations were going to do. And now we have got some guidance on it, and we'll know what the situation is in the coming weeks. So what's being proposed? As has already been stated, the government is proposing a ceiling of CPI plus 1 or 3, 5 or 7%, with a clear preference for 5% by the government, because they think, and it's stated in the consultation document, that it strikes a fair balance between the landlord and tenant. This applies to social and affordable rent only. There is no mention in here to other types of rents, such as intermediate rent. It's not included, and they are outside of the scope of this consultation. So this is specifically just social and affordable rent. So it's very straightforward what's being proposed, but there are other things that we need to take account of when we're considering the consultation paper and if we're putting a response in. The government has stated that this is temporary for 1 year, so for 23 to 24, but they are asking for comments on an extension for a further year. We were just talking about this and discussing who would want it to go on for an extra year. The only thing I could come up with was that it would give a bit more certainty. We know what the position will be for the following year, but they've rolled this out really fairly quickly, so presumably they'll be able to do the same again next year if we're in a similar position. But we don't necessarily want to limit the rents we can increase without knowing what the landscape's going to look like in a year's time. So that's something to think about in your response. The consultation applies to England only. The final point on this slide is about no exceptions proposed, so that the government have made it clear they don't propose any exceptions to this direction to amend the rent standard, the policy statement. And question 5 in the consultation addresses this specifically, and we'll look at that in a minute when we get onto that slide, and I can touch on that a bit further then. A few other points I wanted to make: that the ceiling will not apply to new lettings, so we could be seeing new lets out of a much higher rent than our current tenants in a similar type of property. So formula rents will still increase by CPI 0.1 plus 1%, sorry. And the rent caps will also continue to increase at CPI plus 1.5. So this does not, the consultation does not propose to amend those at all. So that's something to think about for your new lettings. There is reference in the consultation about applying for an exemption if your financial viability is compromised, but obviously this is only ever done as a very last resort, and organisations are not going to be keen on saying to the regulator, our financial viability is compromised. But I put it in there just to mention that's the only way at the moment is being proposed that you'll be able to get an exemption, is if your financial viability is compromised. And this sort of feeds into the second point on this, the final point on this slide about safety. it's very clear in the consultation that the government is not prepared to compromise on safety. And if the implementation of this ceiling or rent cap would lead to an organisation having to compromise on safety, then that would be a reason for you to seek an exemption. So that's going to be on each organisation is going to have to look at their circumstances and what safety issues they have that they need to address, and if they can continue to undertake those works or that service to keep residents safe, because there is no compromise on that point. I'm just going to touch on service charges briefly. Service charges, as we know in the current policy statement, it makes it clear that there's no formal direction in respect to service charges, but organisations should endeavour to keep it in line with the CPI plus 1% increase. The policy statement is amended to reflect the draft amended policy statement is amended to reflect the ceiling. So organisations will endeavour to keep increases to service charges to CPI plus 1, or the cap of 3, 5 or 7. It's drafted with 5 because that's the preferred rate, whichever is lower. So the government is trying to keep it in line with the cap that's being proposed, but they can't do the same as they are with rents because service charges don't fall within the standard. So we were talking about what the regulator would do if they suddenly have a load of complaints about service charges if you're increasing above CPI plus 1 or 5%, and what they will do. Will they ask you to start justifying it? So that's something to have a think about when you're dealing with service charges, because they are going up. Energy prices don't just affect tenants, but they affect businesses, so they will start going up. Right, so questions of the consultation. I've just quoted them here for reference, and I'm sure you're all familiar with them, having seen the consultation paper. All very self-explanatory. The final question 5, which I've referenced already, about exemptions for particular categories. When reading this in context of the paper, it is referring to other types of specific types of social housing. So it would be supported housing, for example. As I said earlier, it's not going to cover things like intermediate rent. That is not covered by this consultation, as it's not covered by the regulation in terms of rent increases. Okay, so just a couple of slides now about the impact on tenants. So rent arrears, whether this is going to limit rent arrears from accruing, or whether they're going to accrue whether there's an increase or not. I think it will be the latter. You're going to be dealing with arrears, so it's going to be managing that and looking at how you're going to deal with this and support residents to pay their rent. Because I suspect, they're going to have very difficult calls to make themselves. Do they pay for their gas so they have heating for their children, or do they pay their rent? It's going to be very difficult for people. So having to manage rent arrears is a very real issue for organisations. We've advised quite a lot recently about hardship funds, whether you have a hardship fund, whether you are going to extend your hardship fund, how you do that, and what you need to consider if you are going to create or extend your hardship fund. Most of you will be charities, if not all of you, and you will have charitable objectives to consider. So if you need advice on that, then give us a shout, and one of my colleagues will be able to assist you with that. But a hardship fund is one way of trying to assist residents, which as I said, we're advising on quite a bit at the moment. So the final slide, just about the response, as Nick said, 12th of October is the date by which your responses need to be submitted by. We're expecting the direction later in 2022, so there obviously has to be enough time for rent increases, for all of the admin to be done prior to rent increases in April, which is the time for most people to increase. The final point about the regulator encouraging evidence-based responses. I did a webinar last week, and the regulator was also presenting, and she very much encouraged evidence-based responses. So explaining and giving examples of why you are making a particular point. That's the way that you're going to have an impact and try and shape this, is with evidence-based responses. So I emphasize that now for when you're preparing your responses. Okay, that's the slides done. So I'll stop the share, and I'm going to hand over to John now to
Before you do, Sam,
yes,
I might as well answer one question that's come up already, which is just to clarify whether service charges are included in the rent cap. Now, obviously, we've got a distinction between social rent, formula rents, where the service charge is on top, and the new rent ceiling will apply to the formula rent, the rent element, and the regulator expects you to endeavour to keep the service charge element within the rent ceiling. But of course, with affordable rent, that service charge is slap bang in the affordable rent. So the service charge is absolutely controlled by the rent ceiling. So any increases in affordable rent, include service charge. So I just thought I'd make that clear to answer that question straight off before we go any further. So yeah, we'll hand over to John now, who's going to talk about shared ownership.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Sam. Yes, hi all. Shared ownership. So the main reason why there aren't slides in relation to this aspect is because it's being treated, as I think everyone is aware, very differently in the fact that from our conversations with Homes England government, they're not actively going to be getting involved, so they're saying, in relation to how you will be applying any potential increases to shared ownership rents going forward in the next review. That said, there is an indication that some stronger messaging will be coming out on what people will be looking for in relation to this area, but it's not part of the consultation. It is, however, a live topic and an area to be considered for organisations, and what this could potentially mean with some quite significant impacts potentially on business plans going forward. So if I just quickly summarise the position that we see at the moment, in the fact that under the terms of shared ownership lease, there is an ability to have a review. That review is linked to RPI plus, and that plus is either based on 0.5% or 1%, or there are some other variations out there. This sort of leads into the first bit. When assessing what organisations want to do going forward, it is essential that a review is undertaken to ascertain exactly the nature of the shared ownership leases you have and the options available within them. The drafting is slightly different within the review mechanisms, and therefore, when looking at whether or not you can apply a different approach, it is useful to consider what are the mix of leases you have, what are the mechanics for those. They should be fairly formulaic. However, there will be differences depending upon the time upon which lease was given. The next point from there is when you look at it, if you look at the sort of more recent form of shared ownership lease, the review mechanism is actually a fixed mechanism. So if I take the RPI plus 0.5%, the review date occurs, it goes up the greater of either RPI plus 0.5% or 0.5%. So therefore, there is actually within the drafting of the model form Homes England lease, a fixed mechanism for that review to go up. Now, the capital funding guide, on the other hand, 4.2.4 refers to the fact that organisations to have flexibility whether they want to charge a lower level of rent. However, the shared ownership lease is traditionally, as I say, for the model drafting, so it's important to check whether you have flexibility within your portfolio, says it is to be the higher amount. So this then leads into the question as to what do organisations want to do going forward and what do they need to think about. So I was just going to touch on now some of the key considerations that a board would need to take into account before assessing what you may want to do given the cost of living impact that's currently happening and the potentially high figures that could be charged. I think it's worth just a pause saying that this shared ownership product, it's always had a bit of a difficult relationship between being an affordable product or is it a market sale product, and different organisations treat it a different way when it comes to their stress testing and risk profiling. Some local authorities have always, I think most people on this will know of some local authorities that have a different view to shared ownership as to whether it's an affordable product or not. So that's where it keeps in this limbo land, and that's what's happening again now when it comes to this review. I can see very much pressure being placed upon organisations not to apply the full amount given the potential impact of that, yet at the same time it's still to be a product that's delivered in equivalent to a market sale with an ability to somebody to staircase at any time and therefore take the benefits of any investment that may be made in relation to the delivery of that product. So it's just worth having that in context. So if you go through it with the key considerations that you may need to make going forward, if you were to decide actually we want to apply a different rate or not to apply an increase on that, what does that mean for an organisation? Now, the first thing to do, as I said, was to check what kind of leases you had. Also to double check which of your organisations within your group hold those leases. The reason for this is that they may be held by a charitable or a non-charitable organisation that holds them, and therefore there's some different considerations come out from that. If they're down within the charitable group, then actually giving a reduction in the rent and not applying the full increase that you could, are you giving an undue benefit or a gift towards a person who doesn't qualify? Now, we've looked at this through some organisations already. We feel there is a potential route forward for this, but boards need to make sure they're taking the due considerations and step at how they're looking at it within the context of the next points I'll come to, but having a proper evaluation and review of this prior to making such a decision. It's very important that if it's within the charitable entity, these considerations are taken on board. The next point is, if you were to make this change, unlike the consultation that's going on at the moment, this isn't going to be a rent level that's dictated upon you as to how you deal with the increase. So it's a decision being made personally by relevant organisations. Therefore, you need to look at your funding position with regards to any lender covenants or wider obligations, or even maybe some implicit ones. If you have modelled a rent increase for your shared ownership of 5%, but then all of a sudden you're applying 2%, or you modelled that you would follow RPI and committed to that, and you had a higher figure in any recent review, if you were therefore then to change that amount now, does that have a significant impact upon your business plan, which would require potentially a fund or lender consent to that change? On top of that, does that reduction therefore have another impact on the wider business plan in relation to how you can deliver on your promises and commitments elsewhere, such as refurbishment, zero carbon, other elements of work that are already committed to in place? How does that sit within that environment? Now, I appreciate that latter point will have a same consideration when the rent levels get set. All organisations will need to keep going back to reviewing how does this mean, because the financial viability standard needs to be applied going forward. And that is something that the regulator will be asking for. If the squeeze comes on rents and those have to go down, can you also manage within your business plan not taking forward the full increase that you could potentially be enabled to under the shared ownership lease arrangement? And those are conversations that will need to be had by boards and stress tested accordingly. Now, that's all in the guise of, if I change my rent figure, I'll be able to get that money, so won't that be great? But there does need to be a recognition by organisations that actually this could mean that rent arrears go up as well. And how would a significant spike in arrears impact in relation to your business plan and modelling going forward, particularly within the shared ownership, thinking about the MPC provisions here, mortgagee protection clauses, what may happen in relation to that? So there is a significant business cost that an organisation will need to take on board, which, as I say, could feed into the whole thought process in relation to how you actually apply the relevant level you're going to go forward. There is also the point of what happens here if you decide to not apply the increase at the correct level. So as I said, you need to review the shared ownership lease and consider the positions in there. It does actually normally the drafting is pretty fixed. It's supposed to be set at a higher level. So therefore, if you decide to set at a lower level, does that mean you are then as an organisation committing to therefore going forward, never receiving the potential benefit of that increase going forward and rebaselining it for years going forward? Or do you want to make a decision which is you apply the rent, but actually you look at some other means of supporting your customers and tenants by allowing them either a period of grace of offsetting that, or do you look to differing levels of how you deal with what could be put in place for them to be able to meet the commitment of the higher rent level? This needs to be factored into also when you're thinking about future business plans and how you're dealing with it. For example, if all of a sudden your stock and rent level is reduced, then that means that portfolio has a different value. So if your intention was potentially for the reversion of interest in your shared ownership to be held in a different entity or moved into held by different organisations that we're currently seeing in the sector at the moment, then any unilateral decision by you to reduce will of course impact upon the value you're able to generate in relation to any potential cross-subsidy investment you're looking to do elsewhere within your organisation. So that also needs to be considered as well. There's also a question as to how the wider investment sector will look at shared ownership if all organisations look to apply no increase or minimal one. Another route which Samantha's already commented on, I know Jonathan will pick up on, is if the full rent increase was implied, could you look therefore at the establishment of some form of hardship fund? That also links into the charitable elements as well. And I know Jonathan's going to put some more comments on that. But as Sam said, if you have any questions on those or the application of different routes, please do let us know. But in sort of summary, the issue on the shared ownership one is it's going to be more market pressure. It's going to be organisations, I would say, talking to each other to ascertain how people are looking to apply it. We're already seeing that in some different regions. People are thinking about it in relation to different stocks and how does it apply. Is the stock of a good or quality level? Is it older stock? Does a different rent increase need to apply in relation to that? How are they going to look into price on a balanced basis for all of their tenants? There's some very difficult questions to be had in relation to it. I think one of the main issues, however, is really do check the shared ownership leases, because technically under the terms of the lease, there isn't as much discretion as to how you would apply this rent increase. And therefore you are going to need to think about other methods in which you communicate it to your tenants and residents, and whatever plan you look to in place, making sure that you're not prejudicing yourselves for years to come. I think that's on my part now. So I was going to hand over to Jonathan next. Is that right, Nick?
Yeah. Thanks. Before you do, I mean, one thing that occurs to me and may have occurred to some of the participants is, I mean, shared owners could face an absolutely massive increase in their financial commitment. Rent increases based on RPI, which is higher than CPI, plus a percentage. Service charges, which are much more extensive and include, refurbishment costs and so on. So much more extensive than tenant service charges. And of course, they face increases in interest rates as well on the mortgage elements of their financial commitment. So, across the sector, I mean, this could be, a major risk for shared ownership as a product. But I'd be interested to hear from some of the participants. Well, and you, John, if you want to comment now.
Well, you've put me on the spot now, Nick. I feel I need to comment. But yeah, no, it's I agree with you. It would be interesting to hear some of the feedback we're hearing at the moment. Some are predicting there may be a spike in final staircasing, as people look at an alternative to taking away the control of the increase. If they have the funds available for a final staircase, that probably sort of gives you an answer as to whether or not that was a charitable need for those particular residents. But there potential could be an increase to the staircasing. There could be an increase to arrears, which have an impact upon it. What happens on the shortfalls? So on some schemes, RP organisations are actually the first port for the private developer or resident management company that's in place, because traditionally shared ownership and market sale in the same blocks, as it were, for example. They are on the hook for making sure that all service charges are paid and look to recover it from their residents. So there could be a funding shortfall getting even bigger. That's on the RP there. And then that leads into, what are you going to do in relation to enforcement and going back to dealing with the MPC and the guarantee back to lenders? So I agree, there are a lot of questions on it. At the moment, I'm not seeing it have a big impact on the shared ownership sale market for new sales, but it'd be interesting to hear from people if they're experiencing that's a slowdown because of concerns over this. I think we're all aware as well, there's a number of organisations out there, campaign groups coming together, which are looking to basically, I'd say, I don't want to use the word advise, but encourage people, if any increase does come through, not to pay it as some form of response to all of this. But I think that's anything that I think people are aware of. Should we go to Jonathan now?
Yeah, we'll hand over to Jonathan now to wrap up our speeches.
Okay, thanks, Nick. So I'm going to look at it in the context of the sort of wider analysis that the boards are likely to have to make. I mean, all local authorities and private registered providers are faced with making some difficult decisions this year in terms of income levels that they're seeking to achieve, and having to balance that with the interests of their tenants and their own challenges with the cost of living crisis. And the fact that the government's proposing a cap in relation to social and affordable rents, as we've seen earlier in this presentation, in some respects narrows the scope of the decision making that RP boards and local authorities have got to take. But equally, there's still an enormous amount or a number of areas in which there is going to be significant discretion and freedoms for boards to assess and establish where they want to set those income levels, whether that's in the context of, as Sam talked about, the relet levels for affordable and social rents, recognising, as I think has already been touched upon, given where service charges sit in relation to affordable, you're going to see an extraordinary narrowing between rent levels for social and affordable, certainly in certain areas of the country. But we've also got the fact that the rent direction doesn't apply to other tenures. John's talked about shared ownership, but equally we've got intermediate market rent, which covers key workers, temporary social housing, to name but a few, and they're all outside the terms of the direction. And obviously service charges, which we've touched upon, but which, to the extent that it is addressed in the rent standard and rent direction, it is confined to the application of service charges in respect of social rent and affordable rent properties. So it doesn't extend beyond that. And so there are, with that discretion in mind, boards are going to have some decisions to make, and they're going to have to make that decision within the context of both the existing economic climate and forecast economic climate, but also the policy agenda which RPs face. So we're, what do we have in that context? We've got issues like build cost inflation running at 9.6, according to the most recent quarterly housing survey produced by the regulator. We've got obviously inflation generally running at a similar level. We've got, or we did have, projected energy increases of potentially up to 500%, although of course that's going to be less now given government's intervention. So we've got that climate, but we've also got policy agendas. We've got a government commitment to more homes. We've got, as Sam touched upon, an absolute imperative on sorting building safety standards. But not only building safety, I mean, not far behind that priority is ensuring decent homes generally for existing stock. And somewhere in that panoply of policy, we've got decarbonisation, where that will land, and whether that will shift in light of some of the noises coming from government is yet to be seen. And all of this has been, as Sam also mentioned, brought to the fore by Fiona McGregor in the recent correspondence to chief executives to remind people of that sort of framework within which RPs need to construct their decision making. And with that in mind, the things that local authorities and registered providers will need to have in mind as decision makers are, in the context of local authorities, as a bare minimum, the requirement to make sure that their housing revenue account does not fall into deficit. So that's a threshold that they'll have to make decisions within. And for private registered providers, as John and Sam have highlighted already, I mean, any decision that's taken about income setting, whether that's in the context of rents, whether that's in the context of those that are within the rent direction, because obviously it is a cap of CPI plus 1 or 5%, whichever is the lower. Those decisions have got to be taken in the context of what that means in terms of the impact on that organisation's corporate strategy, which will have been shared with the regulator and will have to be updated and reissued annually. But also development strategy, development programs, what the impact might be on those. Crucially, what the impact of those decisions are, and I think John did allude to this, was loan covenants. One of what the quarterly housing survey flagged was that before we started addressing our minds to quite what capping on income levels might look like, the quarterly housing survey made the point or flagged the point that many RPs are running very tight on their income or interest cover tests. Indeed, for those that have got significant building remediation plans, probably having to look at waivers from lenders in this year or next, which will only be compounded or at least will form part of that analysis that needs to be taken as to where they set rents to the extent that there is a discretion on it. On top of that, we've got what the regulator has said in relation to priorities, but we've also got the wider regulatory framework and compliance to consider, and that will embrace a number of areas. I mean, obviously all RPs got to comply with all laws, and that sort of touches partly on what we've said already, but does bring in, for many, the context of charity law, and we'll touch on that in a little bit, but also viability. And I know one of the questions that's been raised is about viability, but viability is obviously key, because viability is fundamental in enabling the regulator to satisfy itself that its core fundamental objective of protecting social housing assets is preserved. We need to think about, or RP boards need to think not only about the position as regards existing residents, but, and particularly in the context of those are the charities, they need to be thinking about, you know, prospects of decisions on their ability to further their charitable objects, and therefore providing capacity for new beneficiaries into the organisation. As John alluded to, another angle on charity law is that a question that needs to, you know, be part of the decision-making process for boards, because, as I say, compliance with laws is part of the regulatory framework, is the question of whether decisions taken and benefits given to those that are not perceived to be or deemed to be beneficiaries of the charity is a benefit that is beyond or is disproportionate to the benefit that the charitable RP has identified as being secured for the charity from the decision that it's taken. And all of this then leads to the assessment of whether there are going to be differences within your portfolio for different tenants, different tenures, and different rent levels and increases. And if that is the case, is there a need then for those boards to make sure that they refresh any equality impact assessments so that they don't run the risk of claims or challenges of failures to take account of their duties under that Act? And that does perhaps also lead us back into the point that Sam alluded to earlier or touched upon, which is hardship funds, and whether there is value in making sure that, to the extent that, you know, there is some discrepancy between resident groups as to access to or the generosity of the benefits or caps imposed by the RP, that there's scope for other residents to demonstrate to the organisation that their needs are significant and access to hardship funds required. All of which, I think, if nothing else, ought to remind everybody of the challenge that boards are going to have this year. I mean, these are not easy decisions to make. They're decisions that have to take account of, you know, both you know, very significant concerns that residents will have about their own circumstances, but the needs of the business can't be forgotten, and managing all of that and getting to a position or a balanced position on that which achieves as best as it can the interests of all those concerned is where the RP boards are likely to get to. I think ultimately the question for the RP boards is, you know, are they satisfied that, having weighed all of those things up, can they come to a decision that, having had regard to all of that, is the decision they are taking in the best interest of the organisation, recognising both the needs of their existing and future residents. And if they are, that ought to act as a very decent barrier or protection against potential areas of criticism or complaint, whether that's from the regulator, whether that's from political voices, whether that's from the ombudsman, or whether that's from the residents themselves. But as I say, taking all of those things into account, coming to a decision that is evidently one that's taken all of those factors into account is the best approach, I suspect, for those organisations to take.
Great, thanks very much, Jonathan. That's excellent. Before we move on to the questions, just one observation from myself, if I might. and that is on Fiona McGregor's letter, where she said that she encouraged registered providers to respond to the consultation and talk about the effect on your business plans, on provider finances, on maintaining existing homes, and the impact on delivering new homes. I would provide this warning that, as the consultation does, that if you do respond, do remember that your responses will be published. And so don't include anything that you wouldn't want to air publicly. So with that sort of warning given, I'm going to start on the questions. I'll start with Amanda's question about, are we clear that service charges aren't included in the rent cap? Well, we answered that after Sam's session, that they are included in the rent ceiling, the rent cap, where we're talking about affordable rents, because affordable rent increases are to the gross rent. But the point being, with social rent, formula rent, service charges are on top, and all the regulator can do is to say that they expect you to endeavour to keep within the rent ceiling. Next question, what is defined as viability being compromised? I think that's probably one for you, Jonathan.
Yes, I mean, regulators, we know, regulates with the benefit of hindsight. But in this context, I think there are two aspects to it. One is obviously maintaining a business plan that ensures that the organisation is solvent, and critically that enables the regulator to be comfortable that any disposals programme that the organisation may be choosing to operate as part of its corporate strategy is one that isn't being driven by an organisation that's financial standing is not a healthy one. There's also liquidity forms part of that analysis, but that's probably slightly outside the remit of this question. But so ultimately the challenge will be demonstrating that the business plan remains robust.
Jonathan. Next one is, how is the potential of increased energy costs when existing contracts are renewed for the supply of landlord and tenant gas and electricity supply? I'm taking that to mean is, how do you deal with that? I mean, from a housing management perspective, we are seeing clients who are facing the end of fixed price contracts, and they're having to procure at much higher levels. So when we talk about the inflationary increases in energy costs, on top of that, you have to factor in the end of longer term contracts and procurement of new contracts at much, much higher prices. Now, from the housing management perspective, that begs the question of whether you can start to recover those costs where they relate to service charges. So communal heating and lighting is the obvious one. What happens when your costs increase during the year? Well, I mean, you may have the opportunity to increase your service charges during the year if you run a variable service charge, because obviously a variable service charge is based on estimates, and a well-drafted variable service charge clause will allow you to adjust that estimate during the year. Alternatively, at the end of the year, you'll be able to recover any deficit and carry it forward. But the reality is these service charge increases are going to be substantial. So really, the question is whether you pass them on in full at all. So I think that's probably the answer in housing management terms. Anything to add, anybody?
The only thing I would add is just on those schemes which have CHP plant equipment on them. It has been common for some organisations to enter into sort of master supply agreements with residents, enter into ones directly. But sometimes those master supply agreements can basically have an underwrite placed upon RP organisations. So just when you factor in a potential rent exposure, it's just to maybe have a reevaluation of some of those, because those costs are also going up.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Right.
Sam, how about this one? The cap will potentially mean that affordable rents will become lower than social rents. Is there anything expected to be put in place regarding this?
Consultation doesn't mention anything about that. Obviously, if you've got rents when you let and the affordable rent is lower than social rent, then you can let it social rent plus service charge. But if you've already let and it's just the way it's going because of the cap. I don't see that there's anything that can be done on that. Nick, do you agree, or is your view that you can?
Well, I mean, the rent ceiling is a ceiling. I mean, the rent ceiling is a ceiling, so there is some discretion and some ability to adjust. One of the things we were talking about earlier was the potential for social rents plus service charges. Even with the ceiling on the net rent, if service charges increase enough, then yeah, they could go beyond affordable rents. And in some parts of the country, where market rents are falling, they could even touch market rents, and then consequences there for those properties no longer satisfying the social housing definition. But that's probably beyond the compass of these questions.
What I was going to say on that,
Jonathan, yeah.
Well, the only thing I was going to add to that was, I mean, there'd be enormous pushback if you tried to change the position with existing tenants. Simply by virtue of the fact that they could recover a higher level of income by converting them from affordable to social. But I don't see any reasonable pushback from whether that be the grant provider who's agreed an affordable rent as part of their grant package for those properties to be moved to social rent, given that social rent is the default position under the rent standards. So I draw the distinction between existing and relet in that context.
Yeah. Next question. We have always believed that consultation, this is somebody from an RP, where the RP has always believed that consultation about rent increases with customers is required for compliance with the tenant involvement and empowerment standard. Does the government's consultation impact this? Apart from the practical issue of timescales, might it be sufficient to promote the government's consultation as the opportunity for tenants to share views and influence? Well, yeah, I mean, I know some RPs do consult on their rent increases. There isn't an obligation under the rent standard, but I guess if you are applying the tenant involvement and empowerment standard to the letter, then yeah, you would carry out some form of consultation, but it's not the norm. It's the exception rather than the rule. Would you encourage tenants to get involved in the government's consultation? I mean, there's no reason why not, but it is very much focused at registered providers and local authorities and the businesses. Certainly, I'd say that it's something that you should be discussing with your resident panels to get feedback from them, because it is all about balancing impact on business against impact on residents. I'll just move on to the next question. Sam mentioned that this is only impacting social and affordable rent. It's only mentioned on LCHO. Well, John has obviously talked about LCHO, so that's probably been answered as best we can. Do you think a rent freeze is still a real possibility? Well, not under the consultation. No, at the moment the proposals are 3, 5, and 7. So a rent freeze is not a possibility. Although it is open to an RP to impose its own rent freeze. The rent ceiling is a ceiling. It's not a required amount to increase by. But you'd have to be fairly confident of your viability to put in place a rent freeze. Complaints to the regulator. So I'm hogging these questions, but I will answer this one because it came up with me with a client earlier today. So yes, people do complain to the regulator, and the regulator says that they will not deal with individual complaints. But that's not the full story, because if the regulator gets a complaint from a resident and they think there's something funny going on, then they will investigate. And we've seen that plenty of times, both in relation to rents and service charges. An investigation by the regulator can kick off with a complaint from a resident. Could these complaints be via the Housing Ombudsman? Well, no, the Housing Ombudsman scheme specifically says that it will not look at issues of rent and service charge, or rent increases or service charge increases, unless it indicates some form of maladministration. You mentioned exceptions can be made on the basis of health and safety. Does this cover decent homes? I'm not sure who mentioned that. Was that you mentioned decent homes, didn't you, Jonathan? Or was it you, Sam?
Well, I think it's Sam that was made, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to come down to health and safety. Are you complying with what you need to with the law. And if you're not, and if the residents are considered or deemed to be at risk because you cannot undertake certain works to comply with your legal obligations, then that would, be something to consider. And if there's works required under the Decent Homes programme that means that your residents aren't safe, then potentially. I don't think it's a hard and fast rule about what is and what isn't included on my reading. It's just the safety is very important.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Next one, has there been any discussion around potential exemptions for supported housing? This could be counterproductive as the cost to deliver these services and rent formula is slightly different. Well, the consultation does pick up on supported housing, but then says that they are not proposing to have any different rent ceiling for supported housing, but they do ask you to comment on that in question 5. You're right to say that the rent formula is slightly different in that formula rents can be calculated using the DRC process, and also you have the 10% tolerance, but that only applies to relets. It won't affect increases. Delivery of services, well, we're in the same place really, in that those service costs are going to go up and quite considerably. The only thing that occurred to me on supported housing is that supported housing organisations tend to have a greater churn of residents, particularly where we're talking about move-on accommodation or temporary accommodation, which will with move-on accommodation. So the more churn you have, the more new tenants you have, the more you can recover by applying new formula rents, which, as we've spotted, as we've said, are not caught by the rent ceiling. One for you, John, here. Can you outline the potential outcome if a reduced shared ownership increase is applied and then this is challenged as not being in compliance with the lease? Presumably there's a risk then that the lower increase is disallowed and the rent ends up frozen at the prior year level. There's a nice technical question for you, John.
Yeah, I thought you'd like that one. I noticed the right smile as you read that one out to me. That one, there is a longer conversation to be had in relation to that one. And the initial thoughts are, there is a potential risk. Risk actually, it's one with Nick and myself and others debated. The risk actually is, yes, if they try and claim that you've applied a lower level and therefore it shouldn't be the correct for future rent setting years, well, then their argument is actually you should be charging me more, which seems counterintuitive to what they'll be trying to get to. But then that leads into a question as to how have you been managing your engagement with residents? There is the wider PR implications from this as well. And does that create more disruption? So there is a potential risk. Your counter argument said, no, actually I should increase it, but that doesn't seem the most sensible, or that doesn't seem what either party would really want. The issue with a shared ownership lease is because it's not governed, there's not going to be a government intervention, as it were, in relation to what the rent level should be changed to, so no statutory implication. If you wanted to formally document it, that requires a variation, and then we get into lender consent requirements and additional on-cost in relation to that. Now, there may be ways of looking at how the notices are issued for the rent reviews, and potentially ways of trying to deal with it that way that could minimise the risks to organisations. And yeah, be happy to pick those up and have further conversations on those. That would assist.
Thanks, John. And the next one is really what John was talking about. The question is, could you enlarge on the perception that not charging full RPI increase on shared ownership in the context of charitable objectives? I think that we'd encourage you to get in touch with us about that. We've done quite a lot of work on the implications for charitable status and charitable objectives by not applying the full increase or creating fire hardship funds or giving a waiver on rent arrears. I'd encourage you to get in touch with John or any of us about that. A very quick one, did formula rents also rise by CPI plus 1% during 4 years of rent cuts? Well, we've got a historic question there. The answer is no. During rent cuts, formula rents reduced. They were known as the social rent rate, and they reduced by 1%, 2%, 3%, 4% each year of rent cuts, apart from supported housing, which had a moratorium during the first year, and a couple of others which had a moratorium. For the outcome of the proposal expected later in 2022, when realistically do you think the earliest this would be? Challenges for RP and business planning for the year ahead with this level of uncertainty. Sam, do we know, have they given a commitment? Do you know anything from the conference you were at last week?
No, nothing, just later, which is really helpful, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, what we do know is the consultation will end on the 12th of October, and we do know that there won't be a further consultation, whereas previously, when there's a consultation on the rent direction, there's a further consultation on what the regulator actually proposes to do to implement that rent direction, and the direction has specifically stated there won't be a further consultation. So I think we can say it will be, before Christmas, but whether that's the end of October or mid-November, I wouldn't expect it to be beyond that. I would expect something by mid-November, but
A point to raise in consultation, though, I'd say.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, good point. If consultation comes out at 7%, will some providers go lower? Well, from talking to our clients, yes. I mean, there may well be some providers who go lower because their assessment is that their residents will be put under huge pressure with the cost of living crisis. So it is a rent ceiling. And in fact, the consultation, if you look at the impact assessment, Annex D, I think it is, of the consultation, it does suggest that a significant number of RPs were already committing to an increase of no more than 5%, which is pretty much just a percent more than last year's increase of 4.1%. So yeah, almost certainly that is the case. Question about sharing slides. Yes, we will be sharing slides with everybody. I have been told we can apply to Homes England to convert affordable rent to social rent if the rent falls below social rent level. Yeah. I mean, Jonathan's answered that, but I mean, you don't have to, because with affordable rent, if the rent falls below the social rent level, then you can charge the social rent level and you can charge service charges on top. So there's no need to convert.
But there's also a wider point that would be a big call, wouldn't it? Given that affordable rent is arguably in perpetuity, and this is hopefully a relatively short-term cost of living crisis.
Yeah. Are there still discussions about recouping the shortfall between the 5% increase and the CPI plus 1% in future rent increases? No, I mean, I think that ship has sailed. If there's a rent ceiling of 5%, then your increase in 2024, well, that could also be 5% if the government decides to extend this by another year. But rent increases for social rent and affordable rent are all based on the previous year's rent, so you won't recoup the shortfall. Any changes to the timing of issuing rent notices? No. But Sam, worth mentioning here of the Renters Reform Bill that everyone might be subject to Section 13.
Oh yes, the joy of Section 13 notices. So the Renters Reform Bill is proposing that contractual clauses for rent increases will be abolished, and all rent increases will be by Section 13 and extended from a 1-month notice period to a 2-month notice period. So this is something just to keep an eye on, the white paper, see how it goes, see what goes on, and look out for any e-shots or e-flashes or webinars from us about that, because we're on top of it.
Of course, that may be another piece of draft legislation, which is axed by Liz Truss, depending on whether the original draft was by one of her supporters or not. But there we go. Right, unless anybody from the speaker side has got anything more to say, I'm going to wrap up now. Just to say, you will get the slides, Sam's slides. Do come back to us with any questions. You can do that either by calling us or by emailing us, or by getting in contact with our Devonshires through the Devonshires website. But please do let us have your views on this session through our feedback survey. And apart from that, it remains for me to say thank you very much for attending. We had a great attendance for this, but it's not surprising given the importance of this consultation. So thank you very much and have a good afternoon.